That was Zeppelin, of course. There's a new book out about Jimmy Page, but it's a novel. It's called Searching for Jimmy Page, and it's the first literary novel that features Zeppelin. It was put out by Livingston Press, University of West Alabama, and the author is Christy Hallberg. One critic said that Searching for Jimmy Page focuses on a daughter's journey to grasp the essence of family relationships through cultural icons and musical references. So she's trying to find her family through rock and roll music.
Just a little introductory hello to everybody. Welcome and cheers. For those of you celebrating 420, you know what to do and don't do it on camera. Also want to say happy almost birthday to Liz Goodman, who's here. And just thank you all for being here. Thank you, Nathan, for being my wingman. Nathan's going to handle the chat if anybody's got questions for the Q&A at the end for me, for special guest Chris Charlesworth, who's here, Stuart Epps, who's here, and I'll do full introductions of the guys when we get closer to that part of the show. But if you've got questions, put them in the chat and Nathan will ask them during that part of the show. This has been a wild ride putting this book out. I was so lucky to get amazing blurbs from some great writers like Pamela Des Barres, personalities who were kind enough to read the book and offer kind words. And during the pandemic, I'm so glad that I was able to launch at New York City's KGB Red Room with host Carrie Robinson, who was fantastic. And she brought in some amazing people like Gianluca Tramontana, Jackson Scott, Garth Ritz-Carlberg, Dana Frank, Ivy Supersonic. They were all there making that an incredible evening and did a lot of readings around. But it's the podcast that really got the word out and the book clubs. And I'm so thankful to all of these people who helped me get the word out. People like the Ugly American Werewolf in London Rock podcast, and Nathan on the Lucid show, Drinks with Tony, Heart of Markness, and on and on. And thank you, Liz, for having me at your book club and the Worthless Book Club. That's their name. They're definitely not worthless. And so now we're at the 6-month birthday of Searching for Jimmy Page, and the book has now won several awards. And I just wanted to share a little backstory with you and some pictures and then move on. I'm so honored that Chris and Stuart agreed to be on the show. And of course that Nathan has agreed to help me out here. So we'll just kind of go into the story behind the story. So this was me when I was about Luna's age. Luna is the protagonist of Searching for Jimmy Page. And I used to want to be a guitarist and a singer and an actor and all of that good stuff, but wasn't good enough to pursue that. And this is my bedroom when I was a teenager. So you can see I have been a huge fan of classic rock, Led Zeppelin in particular, since I was 15 years old. And first saw the movie The Song Remains the Same, the Led Zeppelin concert movie. I was 15 in 1985 when I saw that movie. My brother, who's 10 years older, was a massive fan. He was a really good drummer in various rock bands around my hometown in Eastern North Carolina, Greenville, North Carolina. And he idolized John Bonham. So I got into the band through him. And I was very, very close to my mother, and she watched the movie with us and helped me hang posters all in my wall, all in my bedroom. And when Jimmy Page put out his first solo album, Outrider, in 1988, he did a 2-hour call-in show on Rockline. I don't know how many of you remember Rockline. And I was determined that I was going to talk to him. So I have one of those rotary dial princess phones in my bedroom. And I dialed and dialed and dialed, and you get the busy signal and you have to dial again. And I did that for the whole first hour to no avail, and was really wigging out at that point. And so my very conservative Southern mother said, you know what, just go get a Pepsi and chill out and I'll dial. So there's this woman who's, again, she was really old fashioned and conservative, and she's dialing so that her neurotic daughter can talk to a rock star. Well, it didn't happen, but it sort of is a no-brainer that if I was ever going to write a book, Jimmy Page would be the focus of that book. Well, my mother passed away in 2003 of cancer, and I was devastated. So I knew that I had to do something to kind of shake myself out of that. And it had to be out of character and it had to be alone. And I found out that Jimmy and Brian May and Dan Hawkins of the Darkness were going to be judging a guitar contest in London. This is summer 2005. And I decided that's it. Jimmy was so much a part of my relationship with my mom and my brother. And I somehow or other just knew if I could make it there and make contact in some way, not in a creepy way, that maybe I would have the strength to come home and heal. So off I went to the Hammersmith Palais that is no longer there. I think they tore it down in 2012. And I went to the concert, to the contest, and took these pictures, which are horrible because it was so dark in there. And I knew I had one shot. I would never be in that spot again. I had one shot to make contact. And anybody who knows me knows this is not at all how I am. But when Jimmy was leaving, I just took off and chased after him down the hall at the Hammersmith Palais and caught up with him at the stairway and said exactly what Luna says in the book. Jimmy, I came all the way from America just to meet you. And he looked at me and smiled, and his bodyguards are kind of urging him down the stairs to the car park. And he said, I'm sorry. So that was my encounter with Jimmy Page, but I did get a book out of it. So this is what that story kind of became. And the premise of Searching for Jimmy Page is it's set primarily in the winter of 1988. For those of you who don't know, 18-year-old Luna Kane sets off on a journey from her family's farm in the eastern part of the state of North Carolina to England to solve this mystery that her free-spirited dead mother set in motion when Luna was a kid. Is Jimmy Page her father? That's the premise. And I thought I would play for you a recording of the first chapter, which is very short, to kind of orient you, and then take you through some pictures of some of the major settings in the book. So Nathan, let me know if you can't hear this.
The night my great-grandfather died, frigid air howled through the pines and swirled down the chimney of his shack near our fallow tobacco fields in eastern North Carolina. My grandmother and I kept vigil at his bedside, a battery-operated space heater oscillating at our feet, kerosene lamps lofting shadows on the walls. He'd refused to install electricity and insisted the fireplace remain unlit at night. He claimed spirits talked to him through the flue at the witching hour. So did birds, especially owls. He said they were good omens, unless they flew inside your house. Owl in the house means death's coming, he'd say. I lolled my head against the wall, bare like all the others. No family portraits, or prosaic artwork, or thumbtacked greeting cards with snapshots of my great-grandfather's progeny tucked inside. The shack was cluttered with clothes and other debris from a fading life, but the walls were naked. He preferred it that way. No memories or illusions, except the ones that came to him at night. At the stroke of 12, he wrapped his knotty fingers around my wrist and squeezed. "Can you hear it?" he asked, his voice like winter wind crackling through kindling. An icy shiver ran through me. He had not spoken since that balmy summer night when I was 9 years old, when the river ran dry and the pines began to cry. The night my mother committed suicide, an abomination he'd called it, a sin against Providence. He'd sat expressionless in his rocking chair while Grandma delivered the news, his face bathed in candlelight, then hobbled into the woods and chanted my mother's name, like an incantation, a prayer for deliverance. Then he'd spoken no more. I inched closer to him, close enough to smell the implacable stench of the dying. "Hear what?" I asked timorously. "Owls," he said, "like music." My body fluttered, as if I were falling out of oblivion, slowly, unwittingly, the air prickly and thin. Long ago I'd heard a song about owls crying in the night, the singer's wail primeval, in sync with marauding guitar licks, the beat like jungle drums. I felt them vibrating inside me just then, like a distant echo from another life, one that still included my mother. "Can you hear the music?" he persisted, struggling to raise his head. Grandma implored me with her eyes. "I can hear it, Granddaddy." He gave a shuddering laugh. "Ain't in your head, girl." "Where then?" I waited, watching his chest rise and fall, his fitful breast grow shallow, the caesura between life and death. "It's in your soul," he finally said. He nudged his Bible beside him, giving voice to verse. Ecclesiastes 6:10, "That which hath been is named already." He dropped my arm and exhaled, his face pallid and drawn. Grandma and I stood over him, bearing witness, sleep pelting the windows, that song about the owls, its searing guitar haunting me, like fragments of memory I'd buried with my childhood. Grainy images of my mother in her yellow bedroom, with her lavender incense and votive candles, her black and white photograph of a rock star standing on a stage at Kezar Stadium in 1973, dressed all in white, lips pursed, unruly dark hair framing a beatific face, guitar strapped over his shoulder, arms spread wide, as if he were awaiting crucifixion. The two of them were intertwined in my mind's eye, like ashes wafting in a summer wind, waiting for water to receive them. I was born of water and moonlight, and of her, and of him. Grandma stopped the clock on the mantel to mark the moment of my great-grandfather's passing, as if halting time held power, then, forever now. She handed me a flashlight, then draped her overcoat around me, the scent of Jergens lotion and talcum powder lingering in the fabric. "Go on home, honey," she said. "I shouldn't have brought you here." "You didn't," I said faintly. I'd followed her from our farmhouse at dusk, trudged the quarter-mile past the barn and hog pen, through the woods where the footpath ended, as if I'd heard my great-grandfather's keening call. "Go home," Grandma said, prodding me toward the door. "I'll be along directly." I wrenched away from her and stared at my great-grandfather, the withered shell that remained, searching for some part of him that still looked vital, the outline of his body beneath the quilt. Legs splayed as if the cat he used to own were nestled between them, his arm dangling over the side of the bed. Grandma tucked it underneath the quilt her mother had made, tattered and yellowed with age, the same quilt that had covered her while she lay dying over half a century before, cancer ravaging her breast, flies swarming the window screens, attracted by the fetor of rotting flesh, all because her husband had believed he could heal her with ritual and prayer. I harbor a picture of that night in my mind's eye, my great-grandmother's bewildered stare, her mouth a perfect O, a last word half-spoken, an oracle undelivered. Now he was dead, his jaw unhinged, spittle on his grizzled chin, his only child by his side, the daughter whom he only recognized after she'd tell him her name, the name he'd given her 70 years ago. "Do like I say," Grandma said sternly. I stood there breathless, my great-grandfather's milky eyes, fixed and dilated, seeing nothing, seeing everything, boring into mine. Grandma cupped my chin in her hand. "Don't look back," she said with urgency in her voice. I never had before, not after my mother died. Like my great-grandfather, I had not spoken her name since. I had not heard her voice in a brooding summer rain, or felt her hand clasping mine in a sibylline dream, or seen her face in the shadow of a stealthy hunter's moon. I had erased her, and the sainted sinner who conjured music and magic from an electric guitar, his photograph in my mother's bedroom, her unfaithful talisman. I'd never looked back, never, until that winter's night in February 1988, when I was 18 years old. The past summoned like fire in my great-grandfather's shack, phantom owls crying in the night. It was inevitable. Perhaps it was even Providence. Now would return me to then. The tale demanded to be told.
So that great-grandfather is modeled after my own great-grandfather. He's even named after him, Jesse Baker. So, and he actually did try to heal my great-grandmother of cancer with ritual and prayer, and it did not work. The photograph that I mentioned in that chapter is the iconic photograph from Neil Preston of Jimmy Page at Kezar Stadium in 1973. So if anybody here on the Zoom has already read the book and you're wondering about that photograph, it is based on a real one. And that it just always intrigued me. So I sort of always knew that when I started working on the book that I would use that as a major motif at some point. The other thing, before I get into the Led Zeppelin related photographs, when Luna witnesses her great-grandfather's death and he mentions that song about the owls, I'm talking about the song Four Sticks from Led Zeppelin 4. And so her memory of her mother's death gets jarred that night, but it really gets thrown wide open a few days later when her uncle gives her an early high school graduation present of an early pressing of Jimmy Page's album Outrider. And that just sends her spiraling back to the past. And she decides, I've got to go to England and try and find Jimmy Page. So that's what we're going to look at now. So Chris Charlesworth has a great post on his blog, just backdated, about all of Jimmy Page's houses that you should check out. And this is one of them, the Tower House, which is a late Victorian townhouse in the Holland Park district of Kensington and Chelsea in London. And it is just amazing. And you can see pictures of it, of the inside, online. I'm not putting them on here, but it's just a staggeringly beautiful house. And it's just such an interesting example of the French Gothic revival style. So Luna makes her way there, as did I, and you can see my roots in this picture from 2018. And then Headley Grange, which is not a house of Jimmy Page's, but Luna crashes the gate at Headley Grange and goes in and gets to see the Stairway to Heaven. And I didn't have to crash the gate in 2015 when I went. I actually tracked down the owner online and wrote him a snail mail letter, and he was kind enough to invite me. So I have made the Led Zeppelin pilgrimage to the UK 4 times, in 2005, 6, 15, and 2018. And going to Headley Grange is just a wonderful experience. This is what it looks like inside. That's the Stairway to Heaven. The band recorded a lot of the 4th album there. And a lot of people talk about John Bonham setting up his drum kit in the hallway so you could get that ambient sounds. So this is the fireplace in the parlor where Robert Plant supposedly sat and wrote most of the lyrics to Stairway to Heaven. It's an incredible place. Old Mill House. This is in Clewar near Windsor, and Jimmy Page apparently bought the house from actor Michael Caine. And it's here where Led Zeppelin drummer John Bonham died on September 25th, 1980, effectively ending the band. So Luna makes her way here, and down the street, on the same street as Old Mill House, is the Swan Pub. I don't know if it's still in operation. I didn't go inside when I was there, but I peeked in the windows. But there's a scene in Searching for Jimmy Page set there. In 2006, I made my way to John Bonham's grave outside Kidderminster, St. Michael's Church in Rushock. And I had the most amazing experience there. I was the only one in the graveyard, and John Bonham's sister, Deborah Bonham, showed up while I was there. And we had this wonderful interaction where we weren't talking about Bonzo the rock star. We were just 2 girls who had brothers who were drummers. Granted, hers was in the biggest rock band in the world, and mine was just in small bands around my hometown. But that's what we talked about. Her brother, John, not Bonzo, and my brother, Steve. And we just had a very human interaction. And she couldn't have been sweeter to me, gave me a hug before I left. And so that's a really special memory for me. And I don't know how many of you know, Deborah Bonham is a recording artist. She and her husband, Pete Bullock, started a band called Bonham Bullock, and they have an album coming out next week. So be on the lookout for that. The last house of Jimmy Page's, and he had more houses than just the ones that I mentioned in the book, but the last house that I mentioned in the book of Jimmy Page's is Boleskine House in Cemetery near Inverness. And I made my way there in 2018. And I don't drive when I'm abroad. Anybody who knows me and has ridden with me as a passenger in a car here in the States would thank me for that. So I was afraid I'd leave dead bodies in my wake if I rented a car. So I had to make this journey by bus, which was quite tricky. But this is kind of a spooky house. in Scotland. And I found a video on YouTube that it was virtually destroyed by fire, first in, I think, 2015, and then it burned again in 2019. So I was just going to show you a little snippet of this. You get a fuller idea of what the land looks like, because there's the house up on the hill and then the cemetery across the road. Now, to my knowledge, the only house of the three of Jimmy's that I mentioned in the Zoom that Jimmy still owns is Tower House. But you can kind of get an idea of what Boleskine House looks like. Okay, so this concludes this part of the presentation. If anybody needs a book, you don't already have one, or you want more information, you can go to my website. Thank you, Taylor Herbiger and Pulp Digital Marketing for revamping my website. You guys did a wonderful job, but you can find more information there. And now we have Chris Charlesworth with us. Chris Charlesworth is a former Melody Maker journalist. He has interviewed everybody from Led Zeppelin to Paul McCartney to John Lennon, Bruce Springsteen, Iggy Pop, and on and on. He's a former editor of Omnibus Press and author of over a dozen books on various rock legends. Chris is also a former executive producer for The Who, and he was David Bowie's publicist at RCA Records from 1979 to 1981. I wish we were doing a 2-hour show because I want to hear about all of that stuff. But for more on Chris, you can visit his blog, Just Backdated. And we also have Stuart Epps with us. Stuart Epps is a record producer and audio engineer who has worked with such legends as Led Zeppelin. Stuart worked on Coda. He worked on the firm's first album. He's worked with Elton John, Bad Company, and George Harrison, just to name a few. So you can find out more about Stuart at his website. Thank you both for being here. I'm going to stop sharing and we're going to talk to you. Okay. All right. Can everybody hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, great. So Chris, I'm going to start with you, and Stuart, feel free to jump in and add your 2 cents to whatever I ask. So Chris, I know you first saw Led Zeppelin at the Bath Festival in 1970. Tell me a little bit about what that was like.
Well, that was in June, at the end of June 1970, and I'd only been on the staff of Melody Maker for about 3 weeks.
Okay.
So this was the first big event that I covered for MM. I wasn't there on my own. I was there with Chris Welsh, who'd been on Melody Maker since the mid-60s and was a veteran compared to me, and also Barry Wenzel, our photographer. And I arrived there on the Saturday, and I saw the bands that were on that day. And unlike everybody else at the festival who slept in tents, I went to a pleasant hotel in the city of Bath and had a comfortable night and a leisurely bath in the morning. Got back in my car, drove back to the festival. And Chris Welsh was there with Barry, and he was talking to these 3 guys. There were 3 of them, and one of them had a straw hat on. He looked like a scarecrow almost, and the other one looked a bit like some kind of Norse Viking with a pointy blonde beard and very long hair. And Chris called me over and he said, I want to, oh, and the third guy was a huge man, one of the biggest men I'd ever seen in my life, right? He was as tall as he was broad. And Chris said, I'd like to introduce you to Led Zeppelin. And I met Jimmy Page, Robert Plant, and Peter Grant. Bonzo was somewhere else at the time, and Jones hadn't arrived yet. He arrived later by helicopter, I understand. But that was my first introduction to them. So I actually talked to them in the bar a little bit, though as it happened, about 18 months before then, I'd interviewed Jimmy on the phone, because before I joined Melody Maker, I worked for an evening newspaper in Bradford in the north of England, near where I was brought up. And I did a pop column for this paper called The Swing Scene, which sounds really cheesy, and it was really cheesy. And And Zeppelin's PR, the group had only just formed at that time, rang me up and asked me whether I'd like to interview Jimmy Page on the phone. And I said, yeah, all right. And he's formed a new group called Led Zeppelin. I said, will you spell that for me, please? So he spelled it. And he talked to me on the phone for about 20 minutes. And he told me that his group wasn't going to release any singles or appear on TV. And that was really quite something, because all groups released singles and appeared on TV. And he said, we're not like Herman's Hermits.
Well, I would have did that, yeah.
Anyway, that was my introduction to them, actually. And then in the evening at Bath, I saw them perform. And of course, it was like a rocket went off. They had a far better PA system than anyone else, far louder amplifiers. And I thought that this group's going places. Well, they were the big stars of that particular festival. And this was probably their first huge show in the UK. There were about 200,000 people here to watch them. And I remember they just sounded so much better than everyone else. They had better equipment, but I suspect they were a better group anyway. So that was my introduction.
So you spent a weekend with them in Montreux in 1972. And played a couple
I saw them 4 or 5 times. You see, Melody Maker, they won the best group in 1970 that year, and I saw them again at the party we had for the Pole Awards, and so I got to know them a little bit. I think I went to see them at the Alexandra Palace as well. And by this time, usually we were given backstage passes or press passes, so we'd say hello to them, and I was on reasonably good terms with them, though they weren't the easiest people to get on with, I have to say. I wrote about the Who a lot as well, and they were easier to get on with, let's say that, right?
Okay, well, you have to explain that. What was
I know, but the Montreux period, right, that was much later. That was 1972, and I actually did spend the weekend with them, and they were they had a habit in those days. Before they did one of their big American arena tours, they would play a couple of gigs at the Montreux Casino, which was a relatively small hall, held about 1,500 people, just to kind of routine the show. There may be a few numbers that they hadn't played in public before from the most recent record. And so they do a couple of shows to just, as almost like a dress rehearsal, if you like. And I was invited over to watch these 2 shows. And it was fantastic. By this time, of course, the Led Zeppelin were huge. They were selling out the Forum, the Madison Square Garden. They were massive. So to see them in a small place like this was fantastic. But what was even better, well, there's 2 things that from that weekend. They were sort of rehearsing during the afternoon in this theatre, and I went along to watch them. And they were just fooling around, really. And they were playing Elvis Presley songs. They were playing like Mystery Train and Heartbreak Hotel and All Shook Up and Got a Lot of Living to Do and Party. You know those songs like from that early Elvis era? They were playing those songs, and I thought they were absolutely fantastic playing these songs, because Robert was imitating Elvis, and Jimmy was playing the solos that Scotty Moore would play note for note, and Jones was playing a sort of stand-up bass, electric stand-up bass, like a stick bass he had. And Bonzo was playing the rim shots, just like JD, what's his name? DJ Fontana, the guy that was Elvis's drummer. And I thought they were absolutely terrific. And I was watching them there grooving along and digging this. And then then they all wandered off and they went into a big dressing room next door, and I wandered there, and Grant was there and everybody. And I made a joke with them. I said to them, that was fantastic. I said, I really enjoyed that. Would you like to play at my wedding? I wasn't even thinking of getting married. I just said, look, if you play at my wedding, could you do a set like that, please? And Grant said, it'll cost you, it'll fucking cost you. Well,
Oh, great. Yeah, I
can hear joke, of course, but they seem to appreciate that. They did. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And then in the evening, I was there 2 nights. I saw Friday, Saturday night. We flew home on the Sunday, and some of their wives were there. because it was kind of like a weekend sort of, not like a holiday with it, like a working holiday almost for them. And so they were on their best behavior. They behaved in a different way when their wives were around than when they were single, let's say. And we went out to a restaurant on the Saturday night. It was probably the best restaurant in Montreal. Fabulously expensive place it was. And there was about 8 or 10 of us in the party. There were the 4 guys in the band, Grant, Richard Cole, a couple of wives, and a guy called Claude Nobbs. Claude Nobbs was the famous promoter who ran all the shows in Montreal. And he was also Atlantic Records representative in Switzerland. So he was a good friend as well. He probably fixed the whole weekend up for them, you know. And we went to this restaurant, and I mean, you all know what Peter Grant looks like and how big he is. So the menu's passed around, what do you want? So we all order, and Peter Grant orders this massive steak, right? 20-ounce fillet steak. Huge fillet steak he orders with all the chips and veg and salad and everything else, all the trimmings, right? You know, and everybody tucks into their meal. And the waiters are very, very attentive to us when they're around the table. Anything more? Anything we get you, sir? Anything more? Anything more? And Peter Grant finishes his meal, and the waiter comes to take the plate away and says, "Is there anything else you'd like? Can I get you anything else, sir?" And Grant turns around to him and says, "Yes, I'll have the same again, please."
Oh my God.
He did. And he had the same again. He had another huge steak while everybody else was finishing their own course.
Oh, wow.
That's the kind of appetite that Peter Grant had. So that was a very pleasant weekend I had with Led Zeppelin.
Yeah.
But they were always a little bit touchy with regard to the press, and they kept us at arm's length much more so than other groups did, than the Who did, for example. I think this was because in America, though not in the UK, in America, Rolling Stone had been very critical of them when their career started out, and that's kind of left a bad taste in their mouths. And they were never as warm towards the music press as a lot of their contemporaries were.
Yeah, I think the 4th album got a single paragraph in Rolling Stone or something, and it wasn't.
No, I think the 4th album, the Lenny Kaye, you know who Lenny Kaye is? Is a good writer. He's Patti Smith's guitarist. Lenny gave them a really quite a good review, I think, for the 4th album. It was a guy called John Mendelsohn who reviewed the first 2 albums and slagged them off unmercifully. That put them at odds with Rolling Stone. And it wasn't until Cameron Crowe began writing for Rolling Stone, who was a younger writer than most of the older writers that had, that didn't like him. And Cameron was, warm towards Led Zeppelin. Jimmy finally cooled, or at least he warmed, I should say, to Cameron Crowe, whereas he wouldn't talk to anyone else from Rolling Stone. And this brings me on to the 75 tour, which I went on for a while as well. By this time, I was living in America. I'd become Melody Maker's full-time American staff writer based in New York, and I went on several dates on at the beginning of 1975 on the tour that opened in Chicago. And Cameron was with the band then. So was Neil Preston, actually, whose photograph we saw earlier that you put on the screen. And I got to know Neil very well, actually, because I saw him with other bands taking photographs. In fact, I still know him, for that matter. I published a book of his pictures at Omnibus Press many years later. Okay. But on the 75 tour, this was when I actually traveled on the famous Starship with them. In fact, what happened was I was in Chicago with them, and this tour had they had a bit of bad luck on this tour because Jimmy had hurt his fingers. He hurt his fingers in a train door apparently at Victoria Station. I can't think why he was traveling by train. He can afford 10 Rolls Royces and drivers, but he was on the train, and Robert got a sore throat and a cold. And they had to cancel a show or two as a result of this. And we were stuck in Chicago, and I was with them there because I'd interviewed Robert. I think I'd interviewed Jimmy. I can't quite remember now. And I was stuck. If they were stuck, I was stuck, if you see what I mean. And they had the Starship. So they said, well, what can we do? We don't want to stay in Chicago because it's cold in Chicago in January. And we can go to Los Angeles. It's nice and warm there. So they decided to go to LA and leave Robert in Chicago with a doctor looking after him. And the other three, and the various sort of retinue, including me and Cameron and Neil, we all got kidnapped almost, and we went to Los Angeles with them. And it was on that journey I actually flew the plane, because I sat there. Peter Grant came over to me and he said, "Are you enjoying yourself?" You know, yes, Peter, whatever you say, Peter. You don't want to fall out with Peter Grant. And he said, "Would you like to fly the plane?" He said, I said, yeah, all right. And so he said, "Go with me." And so I went into the cockpit, and there's two pilots there, obviously, you know, I didn't do it on my own. And Peter says, "This is Chris, can you ever go?" And I said, "Yeah, all right." So I sat down and got hold of the stick, and there's another guy sat next to me, and I got hold of the stick, and I actually took the plane up, you know, and I pulled it back down again.
Good.
And I flew it for about 20 minutes. So. And I'm thinking, crikey, I've got Page, Bonham, and Jones in the back here. I'm flying them to LA. You know? It was like, and then I came, excuse me. After I'd done it, I came back out and I said, "Oh, Peter, I said, enjoy it." "Yes, thanks very much." He said, "Oh, that's nothing." He said, one tour, Bonzo flew us all the way from New York to LA, the whole way.
Wow. Well, I've got one more question for you, Chris, before I move on to Stuart. So we lost Led Zeppelin's notorious road manager, Richard Cole, not long ago.
Oh.
So I know that you had an encounter with him, and I want to hear about it.
Ricardo. Actually, yeah, it was so sad that Ricardo died. He died like about 2-3 months ago now.
Yeah.
Richard Cole became very famous for his role as if Peter Grant was the 5th member of Led Zeppelin, then Richard Cole was the 6th member.
Mm-hmm.
If there was an inner core of Led Zeppelin, it was the 4 musicians and Grant and Richard. And Richard, he was responsible for entertaining the group on the road, as well as being, you know, in charge, marshalling the road crew and making sure that everything ran smoothly. That was his job. But there were times when the 4 members of Led Zeppelin became bored, and he had to find some form of antidote to the boredom, let's say. And this usually involved entertainment of a somewhat hedonistic nature. However, we won't go into too much detail there, but Richard was also in charge of security, and he wasn't the kind of man you'd pick a fight with, if you know what I mean, because he'd probably win. And he was very suspicious of journalists, very suspicious indeed. All of the journalists, not just me, but everybody else as well. And when Led Zeppelin came over in, I think it might have been 75, when the song Remains the Same, the movie opened up in New York, the premiere, the whole group flew over from London to New York that day. And I understand there was a bit of how can I put it, a bit of a knees up on the plane in the first class compartment, which was led by Richard, who was definitely well refreshed by the time he got to New York. And he came immediately to this club called Ashley's, where I happened to be that night. Him and Robert, and I think a couple of others turned up. I don't think any other members of the group were there, just Robert and Richard and a couple of guys from the security. And Richard spotted me in this club having dinner with my date that night, and he came over and well, he suggested to the date that the date should leave me and go with him, let's say, for the remainder of the evening, and probably breakfast as well. And and she wasn't really in the mood for this. And when she declined, he turned to me and said, "Good to come with me." Anyway, he tried to hit me, actually, because I remonstrated with him. I said, "No, Richard, no, this is not on, right?" And Robert Plant's watching this, I might add, from the other side of the room. And Richard attempted to hit me. I stood up and gave him a shove, and he tried to hit, but he was so drunk he could barely stand up, and he was escorted out of the club. Well, Robert came over and apologized profusely to me for this. I'm so sorry, because I was a friendly journalist, you know. And
Yeah.
as I say, Led Zeppelin, they needed friendly journalists because there were quite a few were unfriendly towards them. But that was an interesting incident, and I understand that, well, the following day, I saw Richard at the premiere for this film, and there was a party afterwards at the Pierre Hotel. And Richard kept a bit of a low profile when he saw me. I think the word had got back to Grant, said, "Don't hit Charles." You can hit American journalists, but not British ones.
All right. Well,
But Richard, I have to say, of all the boisterous people I met in the rock world during that period of Melody Maker, no one had a more change of personality. No one changed their personality more than he did, because he became an alcoholic and a junkie, of course, but he cleaned his act up, and he cleaned his act up to an extraordinary extent. He joined AA, and I think he became, I don't think he became particularly religious, but he became the most clean living, nice, soft-hearted person I've ever met, because I saw him several times in the years after all this, right? And his hair grew grey, and he was like a very gentle person. He liked flower arranging. Can you believe that?
Really?
Richard Cole, he loved buying flowers and arranging flowers, and his constant companion was a cat that he called Puss Puss. He was the most gentle of men, he was, during the final 20, 25, so the second half of his life, I would say. A complete personality change, and a lovely bloke he was. And there was a little bit of let's say awkwardness between him and the members of the group, because he'd told various biographers about things that occurred on the road, which the group weren't delighted about. And at one time they fell out with him, but I understand that the bridges were rebuilt during the latter part of his life, and both Robert and Jimmy went to see him during the last month of his life, because he had cancer and they knew he wouldn't survive. And quite a lot of people, including myself, sent him messages saying terrible, you know. And I wrote an obituary on my blog for him, which was much appreciated by his Zepp fans, I think. Anyway, there you go. I don't think I can tell you much more. Hope I haven't bored you.
No. This is great, and this is a nice segue, Stuart. Stuart, I'm intrigued by this quote of yours about Jimmy after he bought the Mill Studios at Cookham in Berkshire in 1980, where you've been working as head engineer. So Jimmy appointed you studio manager, but you didn't even meet him for 3 months. And you said the Zeppelin myth always painted Page as being a dark disciple of Aleister Crowley. He was a Howard Hughes character, though, I can tell you. So talk a little bit about the Zeppelin myth and what it was like when you met Jimmy. You're muted. Stuart, unmute. Okay.
All right, I'm unmuted.
You're good.
My mouth wasn't working anymore. And by the way, Chris, I was on that starship with Elton actually a couple of years after you. In 1974, we did a.
Oh, you weren't in Chicago with him, were you?
Probably. Was that with Kiki D? It was a tour with Kiki.
Yes, and Cincinnati.
Yeah. I was
on it too.
Well, we've met then, haven't we? Really?
I think we have, because I went on it with Deep Purple, Elton, Alice Cooper, and Led Zepp, the same plane.
They were all on the same plane?
Not together.
The other thing the problem is that I hate flying, you see. So you know, everyone is party time on the plane. They're showing The Exorcist, and I just think we're going to die. And everything.
We should tell Christy
Anyway.
this plane was available to anyone to rent.
Okay,
And after Led Zeppelin had used it, someone else would use it.
right.
Anyway, so right,
Sorry,
well,
Stuart.
the story with Jimmy starts about 1980, really, when I'd already been working with Gus at the mill for, well, quite a few years, since '74. And unfortunately, Gus had to sell the mill, so it was kind of put out to tender. There were a lot of people interested. Then we heard that there was we weren't even given the name. That's how the mystery started. There was a rock musician or an rock artist
Really?
flying in, you know, he's coming in a helicopter, and we're trying to guess who it might be. And we couldn't guess. Anyway, we're in the middle of a session actually with an American band, Shooting Star, and the door opens and Jimmy walks in. Obviously, we recognize him straight away. But so that was great. I mean, he was very quiet. He's, you know, actually, Jimmy's a very shy guy. I don't know if you know that, but he's pretty quiet anyway and pretty shy. So, but following that, we got the message through that actually he was really interested in the studio. He wanted to buy the studio. He was actually on a bit of a buying weekend, because the chap that found the house that you mentioned, the Michael Caine house, in Clewar, he also said, actually, there's a studio for sale that might be handy for you. It's only up the road. So it was an expensive weekend for him, but he bought the Clewar house, and he bought the mill. And, you know, and I also got the message through that he wanted to keep me on as, like you say, as a studio manager and engineer. And so I was really looking forward to that. I mean, not to upset you too much, but to be honest, I wasn't really a massive Led Zeppelin fan, you know.
Say it ain't so.
Terrible. I mean, you know, my closest thing was when Elton John bought his first hi-fi, we used to play Led Zeppelin 3 blasting, you know, and we loved that album. And I also loved In Through the Outdoor. I loved that album. So, but I wasn't, you know, I wasn't crazy about, I wasn't a mad sort of Zeppelin fan. But obviously I was looking forward to Jimmy owning the studio, to working with Zeppelin at the studio. And I was getting ready for that. But as you also said, it was quite a while before I actually met him. I mean, there are quite a few stories, you know. I bought him a bottle of wine, because what he would do is there'd be a message through that Jimmy's arriving at sort of 6 o'clock in the evening, you know, he's coming to see you, and I'd get all ready with a bottle of wine or something and put some get some music ready. And of course he wouldn't turn up. And you know, this was going on. And actually at the time they were rehearsing for a tour, a European tour. And a couple of times I turned up at the Bray Studios where they were rehearsing, and they'd either just left or they hadn't arrived yet. So it was going on a bit, you know. I hadn't met him. Anyway, on this one occasion, a huge American car drives up, and I'm thinking, this is Jimmy at last, but no, it's his driver, the guy that looks after him. I can't remember his name now. Anyway, he came in, he said, look, Jimmy can't make it tonight. I said, well, what's going on? Where is he? He said, oh, he's looning about at home. He's just messing around. I said, oh, I'm coming over. I want to meet this guy, you know.
Wow.
So I followed, do you know what? I can't remember his name. He was a great guy who looked after Jimmy. Anyway, I turned up at the Clewar house, and it probably wasn't the best idea I'd ever had, because I could see Jimmy was kind of busy, not really busy working, but basically he was actually trying to figure out how this house worked. You know, he had this sort of catalog, and he was going around all the rooms and pressing buttons, and rooms were opening and all this. But anyway, at least I met him. We had a nice chat. We had a drink, and so that was the first time I met Jimmy. And unfortunately, not very long after that, we got this terrible news that John, and actually it was when they were together rehearsing for this tour, that John had been found dead at Jimmy's house. So that was awful. So there was, you know, no news really coming from Jimmy. I was just keeping the studio kind of alive and getting it set up. And the very next thing that happened was that I heard that Jimmy was coming into the studio, and that's really when we started working on this Coda album, which has became known as Coda, which, you know, when Jimmy told me that it was going to be a tribute to John, and it sounded like a great idea and a great project. And the first track we actually worked on was Bonzo's Montreal, which was an amazing track, really. I mean, I always say it was like being thrown in the deep end, though, a bit, really, because it was just all drums, and it was a pretty crazy recording. But it was great to be in the studio with Jimmy, and you know, I have got a lot of stories about working with Jimmy, obviously. So, but that was the start of it, and Robert came in to work on the album. That's when I met John Paul Jones, and you know, all sorts of people would turn up, and it was a great project. I was very happy to be part of it, really.
Yeah. What was the atmosphere like working on Coda, given the circumstances? How were they handling things?
Well, there weren't any. No, I know you. I think you said that to me before. That, I mean, the studio is a place where really people get on with it. You know, whether it's Elton, whether it's Jimmy, or whatever. And there wasn't really any atmosphere. It was great to be. You know, I mean, there might have been in Jimmy's head, but I'm new to this crowd anyway. So, for me, it was you know, a lot of reverence towards what we were doing, but it was still to get on with the job, which actually was pretty complex anyway. Right. And you know, we were working on tracks from In Through the Outdoor. We were working on live tracks that he wanted to be made sort of that they were rehearsals. You know, it was a complicated project. And one thing that I was always aware of was that you know, Jimmy Page is the record producer of all the albums. So I was sort of waiting for him to tell me what to do, really. And that never happened. You know, he just we just get on with it. And I'm sure if something was going wrong, he'd have told me. But he was just a pleasure to work for on that album. You know, I mean, I've worked on several projects with Jimmy, and probably the most complicated was really the Death Wish albums that we did. You know, with Michael Winner. But that was all good stuff, and that was for about 5 years.
How did you get involved with the firm?
Well, that was just one of the projects that Jimmy was working on. There was one before that, because he was putting together a band with the bass player with Yes, and actually the drummer with Yes, because he was looking for, you know, something to do, really. He was looking for a replacement. I mean, I actually thought that he would replace John Bonham, maybe with the drummer with Free. I can't remember his name. What's his name, Chris?
Simon Kirk.
Thank you very
Simon
much.
Kirk.
Thank you very much. Yeah,
Simon Kirk.
I think Simon probably thought he'd get that job as well, but you know, as it turned out, they just wanted, you know, the fact that John was gone, he was the major part of the band, so there wasn't any replacing him. So Jimmy was sort of getting involved in other projects. So as I say, there was this one, but that didn't really work out, didn't really have a singer. But you know, Paul Rogers, as part of Bad Company, was signed to Swan Song. Yep. So they were good mates. And actually, you know, that's what happened next. He said, we got this session coming up. There's some guys coming in. They didn't have a name. I was actually there when they were named. But, you know, it was Chris Slade and Tony on bass, and the best singer on the planet, really, Paul Rogers. And that was a absolutely amazing project. You know, they set up pretty much live in the studio. And I mean, this is my home, really, the studio. There's nothing foreign about it. I'm very comfortable there. So it was nice to be able to welcome them into this space. And it was a great band, totally brilliant band. That was the best project we did, without a doubt. And it was very, great atmosphere most of the time, and it was all good.
Hey, Stuart, can I ask you a quick question about Coda? Speaking of Bonzo's Montreal, do you remember, were those principal tracks recorded in Switzerland, and was it kind of a finished idea, or were you piecing it together?
It was finished. It was very complicated. It was very full of drums through all sorts of effects. You know, the main thing was actually we edited it in the end, because I think it was longer than the original version, I think we edited it from the multi-track version, And it was just trying to make sense of, which often was the case, of what Jimmy had in mind, to be honest. And sometimes his explaining of things might not be that clear. So I always used to say, we'll just go for it. But no, it was a finished track, and a lot of what I did with Jimmy had, only sort of, you could only really understand it once it was finished, to be honest, because it would all be in his head, and that includes guitar solos, and a lot of the work we did on Death Wish. He's got a phenomenal studio brain, basically, as well as being a great guitarist. He's also a brilliant musical brain in the studio, and it's his ideas that are actually I always thought the most interesting, even with regard to his playing, really. So yeah, the Firm was a great project. I still love to play it now and to hear it now. It was all very good. Yeah.
Well, I was just going to ask, what was he like as a producer? And you sort of answered that, but is there any sort of idiosyncratic thing that you can remember about him as a producer?
Yeah. Well, there's probably lots of them, because to be honest, I can talk about that period for hours. But I suppose one that's worth mentioning is that when we were doing guitar solos, which probably people relate to with Jimmy, that he's the best soloist in the world and this sort of thing. What he would generally do is he'd go out there, like a lot of guitarists, and do maybe 4 or 5 solos, and then we'd either piece one together. But one thing he did, which was I've never seen done before, he used to say, play them all at once. So we'd maybe put up 3 or 4 guitar solos, and then he'd form the solo that he wanted to do from the 4, and then we'd have to piece it together. So that was interesting. And actually, a lot of the time when we were doing it, I thought, this isn't going to work. That doesn't fit with that, and this isn't fitting with that. And but he had it very clear in his head. That was, like I say, he's probably he's an outstanding producer, an outstanding brain, an inventor, really, in the studio. I mean, I can go on about that forever. When we did the Death Wish albums, he used Roland guitar synths when no one else had them. He used to use this thing that they brought out that I'd never seen before. I've forgotten what it's called now. Theremin. Thank you, Chris. What would I do without you? So they brought out this thing. So he used the theremin in his studio that he had before the mill. He had one of the first automated desks built just for himself. And when he bought the mill, all this equipment arrived, all sorts of things. So he was very much an inventor in the studio as well. He had a very inventive mind, as a producer. So I learned a lot from him in that respect.
Did he tend to reference things really loud or quiet? I've recorded several albums, and I've always found it interesting to how a lot of engineers are going deaf anyway, and so they reference everything punishingly loud, or they do it just to get you out of the studio.
It's funny you should say that, because John Bonham came, not John Bonham, the bass player, John Jones came in. And I think we were Jimmy wanted me to play him a track that we've been working on. So I sort of whacked the volume up, and the Mills monitor system was unbelievably loud. And he went berserk. He said, "What are you doing? Turn that down. I can't sound." And I thought, well, here I am with what is supposed to be the loudest, heaviest band on the planet, and they don't even like loud music. What's going on? So I think when we were doing that Bonzo's Montreal, I used to love having the monitors there blasting, and Jimmy never complained. So he liked loud music, but I can't even remember what levels we probably listened to all sorts of levels, really.
Well, I see Mac from the Ugly American Werewolf in London rock podcast has joined us. And I know that Mac and Nathan both interviewed Deborah Bonham and Pete Bullock, I think within a week of each other. And the Bonham Bullock album is coming out next week. Do you guys want to talk at all about that experience?
Which guys?
Sure, I'll speak up. It was a real pleasure. I mean, I'm a huge John Bonham fan, Keith Moon fan. In fact, Chris, I brought this up to show you. It's one of my favorite collections ever. It's so good.
I am I'm credited as an executive producer on that. Yeah.
Well done. It's such a good, it's such a good record. So yeah, I was nervous. I don't usually get that nervous. I grew up in LA and I've grown up around a lot of celebrities, so it usually doesn't get me off. But I was definitely off kilter. And she's a delightful person, and she put me at ease right away. In fact, she wouldn't let me use the video, take any pictures, because she had just, she had fallen. She had some kind of farm accident. She's just like John, you would imagine. She was in like a horse stall when I interviewed her, and she had just, it was an eye. She had a horrible eye injury. So she had this big shiner, and she's like, Pete, we were not brawling. And so we started laughing right away. And then we just, it was so great that she answered the one question I wanted to know was where did John Bonham get the work ethic and the production value? Because everything he's associated with, he's called, the beast, and, I'll have all these wild tales about him, but he was very specific about everything he did, all his choices. And she said that it was his grandfather was the one, his maternal grandfather was the one that kind of imbued that to him. And so I was so happy to learn that from her. And the album's incredible. I did not know what to expect. She's a fantastic singer.
She's amazing.
She's really good.
Yeah.
And hearing how like she's still in touch with Robert Plant, since they were best friends and all, and he's still in touch with the family.
Mm-hmm.
And she was just wonderful, and explained how she and Robert and other friends kind of pick songs, along with some of the Bad Company crew. They all pick songs together, and I couldn't be a better interview. I was really happy.
Oh, so wonderful. Mac, do you want to throw in anything about your experience talking with her? Because you did a great show on her too.
Well, thank you, Christy. Yes, good to be here. No, she was lovely. And Peter, he's just a funny guy. He's the kind of guy who you want to sit down in the pub and hear some stories about. And it was great to hear him getting to warm up Jeff Beck's guitar in his equipment one day, trying to remember Beck's Bolero after 30 years of not doing it, and doing it in front of although behind a curtain, in front of about 10,000 fans, thinking, wow, Jeff has really kind of forgotten how to do his hits, hasn't he? But no, they're lovely people. Turns out they lived half a block away from me here 30 years ago. It's just a small world here in London.
Because Mac is in London, for those of you who don't know that.
Yes, the ugly American werewolf in London. And no, they were great. Great stories, genuinely good people. And no, it's been a good show for us. Yeah.
All right. Well, if anybody has any questions about anything, feel free to. There are not that many of us, so I don't think you need to worry about the chat box. Just unmute yourself and ask away.
Chris, I have a quick question for you. Do you remember, or do you know where you guys came up with the Life with the Moon segments? Like, were those actual BBC recordings? Is it Life with the Moons?
They were done with a BBC radio producer called John Walters, who was also John Peel's producer, as a matter of fact.
Oh, okay.
And I think they were sourced by my co-producer on that box set was a guy called John Astley, and John was actually Pete Townshend's brother-in-law. His sister was Karen, who was Pete's first wife. And John found them through this guy, John Walters, who was the BBC radio producer. I think they were broadcast, but they weren't. They were broadcast as part of a bigger show with some music.
Like for Boxing Day or something.
Yeah.
It seemed like one of those.
I remember that box set. You know how it opens up with Pete screaming on the stage.
With Abby Hoffman?
That came from a bootleg record I had, right? And he's swearing at effing and blinding ears, right? He's a fucking rock concert. And I got that, and I remember I played that to Pete, and I said, Pete, I think we ought to open the box set with this. And he said, yeah, but it makes it sound like I'm a screaming madman. And I said to him, quite. Exactly. And he took the point, right? So that's how we began it. Yes.
That's great. Do you know what's up with it? It's not up anywhere. It's really hard to find. It's out of print. It's not up on Spotify.
I don't think it is. I mean, I haven't tried to buy it recently, I must say. Sure. That was the first thing I did. I mean, this got me in. I mean, we're talking about the Who now, but I got involved in a whole series of Who reissues, and essentially I selected the bonus tracks, and what I did was I commissioned the artwork, and I worked with their designer, a guy called Richard Evans, and did the photo research and the text. Some of it I wrote myself. For other text, I commissioned other writers, and we worked our way through the whole of the Who's catalogue during the 90s. Now they're doing deluxe reissues, probably now. So this first series of reissues that I did have been superseded by the deluxe versions now, which are a lot more expensive.
The Baby Don't Do It on Who's Next is fantastic. It's one of my favorite. So good, yeah.
I know. And I was the one thing that annoyed me about that box set was I wanted a full live Tommy on it. I wanted a 5th CD, and I begged and pleaded with Polygram, and they wouldn't let us have a 5th CD. I wanted the full Tommy from Leeds, which is now available in reissued live at Leeds, of course. I wanted that one, and we also have the one from Hull, if you know what I'm talking about. But I'm getting into Who anorak stuff here, so we won't go into it.
Sure.
Stuart, were you going to say something?
Well, because you're in search of Jimmy Page, I thought I should tell you where he is.
Please do. Tell me where he is.
He's outside the door here. He's just coming in.
Oh. Well, darn. I need to get a book to him, but I don't know how to get it to him.
He's in Sonning.
Yeah, I know, but I don't know that mailing address, and I figure, well, even if I did, would it even get to him?
Well, if you put Jimmy Page Sonning, I think everyone knows where he is.
Oh, you think that would do it, huh?
Yeah, I think it would. Yeah, it's
like the majority of the village is taken up with his house, which is next to the. It's actually next to this.
I don't think there's any other Jimmy Pages in Sonning on Thames.
It's actually next to the cemetery. He seems to like living next.
He does seem to like that, doesn't he? Yeah.
Is he still working with Bill Curbishley? Are they?
No, I don't think so. No, I don't think Bill manages him any longer. No.
Okay.
I don't think Bill only manages the Who at the moment, as far as I'm aware.
Well, so the last thing
he might have. Sorry.
The last thing he did was the album with Scarlett Sabet, where it's a spoken word album, and he's playing music behind her poetry. So he doesn't, I don't know that he's done anything else. And that was recent. That was in the last year or so, year or two. Yeah, well, I have to ask you, Chris, the rumor is that Pete Townsend is not fond of Led Zeppelin. Was that actually true?
Well, there was a certain amount of competition between the Who and Led Zeppelin during the 70s, and I don't think there was ever. I don't think Pete particularly liked their music. I think that was it. I believe now that any antagonism is completely softened. You know what I mean, and they all get on very nicely, but. I think Pete felt that the subject matter of Led Zeppelin wasn't as profound as the subject matter of the Who. Let's put it like that.
Oh, he had an issue with "Hey Hey Mama."
Well, Pete was more of a philosophical lyricist.
Yes, I know.
Let's put it like that, right? And I think. The Who came from a different angle. The Who had been a pop group once upon a time. Led Zeppelin were never a pop group.
Right.
You understand what I'm saying?
Yes.
The Who became a rock band. They graduated to becoming a rock band, and they played more gigs up to Tommy than Led Zeppelin played in their entire career. And it wasn't until Tommy that the Who became superstars. So the Who felt that they'd done their homework more.
They paid their dues.
In a way that they worked harder to do it, which they certainly had, right? Whereas it happened overnight for Led Zeppelin as a group. It didn't happen overnight for the individuals within it, I know, but it happened overnight for the group. And that may have caused a little bit of angst slightly.
Right.
If you understand that point.
Got it.
Yeah.
Well, thank you both so much.
They appeared on the same bill once in Washington in 1969, in Washington, D.C. That's the only time they ever played together, and the Who topped the bill.
Well, thank
John
you.
Bonham and Keith Moon did. There's a ton of footage now that finally just came out. It's up on YouTube. The last Forum show
Oh
in
yeah, I've seen that.
1977. It's so
Yeah, Keith
funny.
came on and fooled around, didn't he? Yeah.
It's really good.
Stuart and Chris,
Right.
thank you so much for coming on board. Nathan,
That's
thank
all right.
you for
It's been a pleasure. It makes a change from watching the news at 10.
and thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it, and have a great evening. And I'm going to sign
And
off.
incidentally, Hammersmithodian has not been demolished. It's
Oh,
just
it
got
hasn't?
another name. It's just got another name now.
Okay, I thought they tore it down, but they just changed
No,
it.
they didn't tear it down.
Good to know. All right. Thank you, everybody.
Great to meet you, Stuart.
Bye-bye.